Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we are heading to the far north of Europe, and we're going to look at a war within the Second World War that had a profound impact on how the wider conflict would develop and also end. I am talking about the 1939-40 Soviet Finnish War, also known as the Winter War. Hi Jesse, good to be back. Good to be talking Eastern Front again. We've done quite a few Eastern Front podcasts lately, but this is a different aspect. It's a very different angle of the Eastern Front. So really happy that we're looking at this today. Before we get into this, I would like to apologize to everybody out there who is Finnish or speaks the Finnish language. My Finnish language skills are zero. There are some languages that might be even more difficult than German, and I think Finnish is most definitely one of them. So I am going to butcher the Finnish language when I'm pronouncing words. Not quite sure about you, Jesse, how your Finnish is. Mine is non-existent, so my apologies. Before we start talking about what happened in 1939 and 1914, how it really impacted the course of the war all the way up to 1945, it is, as always, important to look at the context. A typical historian's disease, it's all about context. I keep saying it, there is no black and white, everything is grey, nothing is inevitable in history, and also context is key. So let's have a look at the wider context, the wider history behind that. Jesse, talk us through it a little bit.
With pleasure. Hi, Matthias. Hi, everyone out there listening from Finland. I'm going to have to add my apologies in advance to Matthias's. I'm not bad with some languages. Finnish is unfortunately not, or maybe not yet, on my list. In any case, as far as context goes, we're not only going to get into the historical context of this campaign, and I say campaign on purpose because one other name for it in the Soviet historiography, in the Soviet tradition, is the Finnish campaign, what we call the Winter War. And I think that's a little bit revealing that it's just one campaign in a series of wider objectives for the Soviet Union. But I also want to talk about the context of our podcast here. I'm very happy to report that it seems there are a lot more of you listeners out there than there were at the beginning of the podcast. Things are going well. The podcast is growing. That's what we want to see. Interest in serious history. And of course, we want to continue to grow with your help and reach more people. And in particular, those of you who are listening out there on Apple Podcast, please, if you enjoy what we do here, leave us a review. We are all part of this attention and algorithm-based economy, so to speak. So if you leave us a review, if you're listening on Apple Podcast or anywhere else, but in particular Apple Podcast, that would really help us out. Now, after that little context surprise, to the historical context, back to our familiar disease, as Matthias mentioned. So we'll start at kind of the beginning, let's say, in a way, with the Finnish side of the story. So the war begins between the Soviet Union and Finland in late 1939, but we want to trace those roots a little further back. Finland, of course, for quite a long time, was a part of the Russian Empire until 1917. It was not a typical part of the Russian Empire, though. It was a duchy that wasn't subject to some of the same laws and practices as other parts of the empire. There were some differences for conscription, for example. So it was slightly less subject to the centralized control of St. Petersburg. But nonetheless, when the Russian Revolution happens in 1917, Finland declares its independence. Now, you might think that that's the start of an interesting, and if you're partial to Finnish national self-determination, lovely story. But it's not, in a sense, because Finland is almost immediately or very soon afterwards in 1918 plunged into an absolutely brutal civil war that most of us out there, outside of Finland, haven't really heard much about. It's extremely bitter. On the one side, you have Bolshevik-minded forces supported by the Bolsheviks in Russia when the Russian Bolsheviks could spare resources from their ongoing revolution and civil war. Even Joseph Stalin was briefly in Finland as a part of the support from the Russian Bolsheviks to the Finnish communist Bolshevik side in the civil war. And on the other side, you have what's often referred to as the whites, basically the anti-communists. They are supported in 1918 by the Germans, primarily, who've not yet lost the First World War. So they're still in this geopolitical game. It is extremely bitter. It's extremely deadly. If memory serves, something like up to 6% of the population of Finland dies in this civil war, which lasts less than a year. So, I mean, this is extreme amounts of violence. In the end, the anti-communist forces win, and an independent Finland comes about. It becomes a democracy, but it's a small country. It's not particularly wealthy. It's not particularly industrially developed. It has two reasonably large cities, medium-sized, I guess you could say, to be honest. It's a sparsely populated country, of course. Helsinki, and the second largest city, which you may or may not have heard before, called Viipuri, which today has a different name, and we'll get to that in a moment. So the borders are, at this stage, the same as the borders that the Duchy of Finland had within the Russian Empire, with one exception. They acquire the Arctic port of Petsamo. So basically, Finland gets its independence, and the Bolsheviks in Russia, because of the pressure they're under internally, agree to give newly independent Finland one small Arctic port, of which we shall hear again. So that's a little bit about the Finnish side of things. Matthias, why don't you give us a little bit about the Soviet context? What's the situation in the Soviet Union building up to this clash in 1939?
Well, of course, the Finnish and the Soviet circumstances are linked. You already talked about the situation of Finland within the Russian Empire, and I think that's absolutely crucial. For example, when you talk about the Civil War, and you talked about this, why do you have this war? How is it played out? It's because you have this Grand Duchy, which is part of the Russian Empire, doesn't really feel part of it, doesn't really take part in the First World War. We've got a number of volunteers being sent to the Russian army. You also have, for example, a very famous unit, the 27th Jäger Battalion, which is a Prussian unit, which consists of Finnish volunteers. And when we move forward and we look later on at World War II, you see that most, not all, but most of the leading military people in the Finnish military, in the Finnish army, had actually served in the First World War on the German side in this battalion fighting against the Russians. And you can even jump forward to today. Even today, the Finnish army has a very, very close relationship and a very close link with the German light infantry. So it all goes back to this. So you can see, of course, it's all mixed. It's always history, and war is always a two-man game, so to speak. And when you look at the Soviet side, well, of course, you have the First World War. We're not talking about this. That again would be 15 different podcasts you need to talk about and to have on this. But you fast forward, so you have the revolution. The Soviets are eventually in place. That in itself is absolutely fascinating. The Russian Civil War, also the interaction the Russians have with the Western powers. So you have an expeditionary force from the States, from France, from Japan, from Britain. There's all sorts of stuff going on, but it's too far, or would lead us too far, to talk about all these things. So the Soviet Union is now established in the early 1920s, and the Soviets, the Soviet leadership, were there, of course, looking at exporting this whole idea of communism. There's a bit of a problem because with the end of the Russian Civil War and the end of the First World War, it is obvious that this is not going to happen very, very quickly and very, very fast. So once Stalin comes into power, he's trying to more consolidate the situation within the Soviet Union, and then at some point of his choosing, when it's strategically right, to then start exporting communism and fulfilling his, what you might perhaps call, imperial desires. When you look at the map, he actually does have a point, because the problem for the Soviets is that with the loss of Finland, which has now become independent, they have lost the forefield, the buffer zone towards the northwest. And when you look at St. Petersburg or Petrograd, or Leningrad, whatever you want to call it, the second largest city of the Soviet Union. That is about 35 kilometers in those days from the border. So there is no strategic depth. And the Soviets are worried that whatever might happen, an enemy might use Finland as the jumping off board, the starting point for an invasion of the Soviet Union. And the Soviets, because that is the experience of the Russian Civil War, they think, like most people did in those days, if you control Moscow and St. Petersburg, you control the Soviet Union. So you can see there is a strategic worry that they have here. And you can combine this then, of course, with points of ideology. So you're surrounded in this ideology by capitalist powers. They all want bad things. You look towards Scandinavia. So you've got long-standing enemies like Sweden, for example. Finland used to belong to Sweden up to the early 19th century. Only after a lost war, it then becomes part of the Russian Empire. You can see there are all sorts of issues and problems. And it's not only in Finland where they feel this pressure and where they've got this angst, really, but it's all part of this idea of having a buffer zone, building up a forfield. And you can see this being played out in other countries further to the west as well. The Baltic states, for example. And then, of course, you move into the famous, or perhaps you might say, infamous German-Soviet treaty, sometimes called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty after the two foreign ministers, the Soviet Union and Germany, sometimes also called the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So maybe we should unpack that a little bit more. So, Jesse, talk us through whatever you want to call that pact.
Yeah, the pact is absolutely key here, because this is going to give free rein to act on these strategic concerns, strategic fears, on the one hand of the Soviet leadership, but on the other hand, I suppose we could also interpret them quite realistically, or reasonably, I should say, as imperial desires with an aggressive side of conquest to them as well. And this, I think, is also part of the backdrop. Not only those strategic fears of, say, the Gulf of Finland being a place where the evil capitalist powers in the Soviet ideological thinking could project their power into the Soviet heartland, but also this idea that of state power and expanding it, expanding the influence, recovering parts of the old Russian Empire. Before I get into the details of the pact a little bit more, though, the context of the pact, there's one more question that's not quite so tied to ideology, but I still think is an interesting wrinkle in this conflict, which is the so-called Karelian question. So this strip of land, basically the border area, the border regions between Finland and the Soviet Union, is usually referred to as Karelia. I think any Risk players out there will know it from its famous region in the board game Risk called Karelia.
You're showing your age here.
I am showing my age here. I grew up, I cut my teeth on Risk. I've since moved on, but in any case, this Karelia region, on the Soviet side, many of the people there are either ethnic Finns or they're members of smaller ethnic groups who have a similar culture and a closely related language to Finnish. And some of them launched a small rebellion against Soviet power in 1920. So this automatically has, if you put yourself in the mindset of Stalin and other convinced Bolsheviks, this automatically puts this region further into a sort of risk category where the locals might not be loyal to the cause and so on and so forth. This whole situation does lead to a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Finland in the 1930s. But of course, as you probably already know, since we're talking about the Winter War out there, listeners, that non-aggression pact is not really worth the paper that it's written on. A fate shared with the much more famous Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact of August 1939. There's a lot that can be said about the Nazi-Soviet pact, but I want to focus on what is relevant for us here with the story of the war with Finland. And essentially, that's the secret protocol. And so there's a secret component to this Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact that essentially divides up Eastern Europe and gives each of those two powers, Germany and the Soviets, a free hand in different parts of Eastern Europe. The Soviets get the free hand in Eastern Poland, which they, of course, then invade concert with the Germans in September 1939. They get a free hand in the Baltic states, which are independent at this point. And so then in October 1939, they force the Baltic states to accept de facto Soviet occupation, so Soviet bases and troops, even though they don't want it. And Finland is, of course, then also given over, so to speak, to the Soviet sphere. So the Soviets now have freedom of action to do what they want in their border areas. And that is essentially a big reason which allows them to pursue this campaign in the end. What did I miss, Matthias, in that little summary?
I think it's all there. I think it's all there, so we can stop the podcast right now.
As usual.
As usual,
You're
absolutely. The non-aggression treaty really is interesting, and you've already talked about the implications of this. And of course, when they signed this treaty, that wasn't secret. Everyone knows that Germany signs a treaty with the Soviet Union. But of course, you have, as you've already mentioned, the secret protocol, which basically divides all of Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did actually not acknowledge its existence all the way to the 1990s, which is quite funny because the Western Allies found the German original documents in the German archives in Berlin in 1945. But again, you can see how history is also very important for contemporary politics because all sorts of things are related to this big question. And a lot of people, when the war broke out between the Soviet Union and Finland, I'm jumping ahead just for 1 second, a lot of people were actually confused and surprised that the Germans didn't support the Finns, because traditionally Finland had always had very, very good relations with Germany, the German Empire. Go back to the point I made earlier about this volunteer unit, an entire light infantry battalion consisting of Finnish volunteers. And everyone said, well, if there's any nation here that should be supporting them, well, then, of course, obviously, it's Germany. First of all, you've got great relations. And also, these guys are fighting against communism. Isn't that what the Nazis want to do anyway? So a lot of people are quite confused, but that's because they didn't know about the secret protocol, which really writes off this entire part for the time being for the Germans and hands it all over to the Soviets. Hitler's great plan, of course, in the end, that he would conquer all of that anyway once he's defeated the Soviet Union. But you can see how these small countries, and let's class Finland as a small country here amongst others. I mean, it's bigger than the Baltic states, but it falls into the same category. They are basically the bargaining chips of this big map that Ribbentrop and Molotov actually sign on the day in Moscow and say, well, this is the borderline and this is exactly how we're going to be doing it. And you talked about the Baltic states. I mean, it's all part of the same game, really, isn't it? You talked about the Baltic bases that the Soviets demand. And of course, the Finns, they can see, well, things are happening. Things are going on. Things are happening. Yes, they've got this non-aggression, this neutrality agreement pact with the Soviet Union. But how much is that really, really worth? So when war then finally does break out in 1939 in September, when Germany invades Poland, Finland is very, very quick to, well, not very quick, but it takes them about 2.5 weeks, but still quick to declare its neutrality. And so we don't want anything to do with this. We're not interested in this war. It's interesting that they feel the need to declare neutrality. So you can see there's already pressure here, and that, of course, is to do with the invasion of Poland by the Soviets as well. They feel and can see that even though they're on the periphery out there, they are to a degree also in the spotlight, and people are looking at them, and that, of course, means it's the Soviets, and that, of course, then means that as things develop, and they develop quite quickly, this situation gets worse for the Finns. So on the 5th of October, for example, the Soviet Union announces that it wishes to discuss territorial concessions by Finland. Again, the main idea behind that, well, these are basically Russian territories. It's all strategic depth. You will understand. It's a bit tricky. Well, here's St. Petersburg, Leningrad in those days. Well, we might want to have a bit more depth here. Why don't you give us a bit more territory? You can see where this is going. Of course, normally what you would then do, you would say, as an independent and sovereign nation, I know that's not happening. Well, go home. We're not even talking to you. However, you can see how much pressure the Finnish nation is under, because they actually sent a delegation to Moscow to talk about these things. And they go on for quite some time. And while this is happening, The Finnish army is also mobilizing. We'll talk more about the army and the armed forces in a minute. So to a degree, it's a mini appeasement, you might say. It's a little bit like what Britain and France did in early 1939 and 1938 with Germany. But then it's pretty obvious that in November, on the 30th of November, these talks and discussions end without resolution, and everyone is now just waiting for the big explosion. And this big explosion comes in November, where the Soviets, in very typical Soviet style, create an incident. The Finns are waiting for an incident to happen. They know that the Soviets are ready to go. They've massed their troops. They're again more about the military in itself in a minute. They've massed the troops on the border. Everyone knows something's happening. You're just waiting for the spark to set everything off. The Finns actually withdraw their artillery units from the front line. They bring them inland, say, in order to avoid any chance that a Finnish artillery round might land on Soviet territory, and the Soviets might then use that as an excuse. And yet, and historians now agree on this, that was all created, massaged by the Soviet government. They blame the Finnish army for cross-border shelling. An incident in a place called Mainila, where a number of rounds come down, no one really gets hurt, and that is basically that's the casus belli that the Soviets are using. Now, historians agree that that was basically Soviet artillery fire coming down there. You can see there's a very typical, a common story being played out here. If you want a war, you will get one. So very, very straightforward to create such an incident. Jesse, what do you make all of that?
Well, I was going to say, was there by any chance a small radio station where those shells crashed down? Because that's, all of my lights are going off for Gleiwitz in Poland on the Polish-German border in September, and the similar excuses that were made there. One of the elements that I find quite interesting about this build-up period in the final sort of month or 6 weeks, when the Soviets come with these demands, well, you might even call them an ultimatum in a way, if you want to be realistic about it. Essentially, they want the border to be moved. They want the Finns to destroy any border fortifications. They're willing to give the Finns some chunks of uninhabited swamp in Karelia, essentially. But, which, as you correctly pointed out, normally a sovereign country would say, "Hey, get lost." This is not how our international system works since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, right? This is not how it's going to go. The League of Nations guarantees that these sorts of things shouldn't happen in theory, on paper. But in practice, the Finns are quite divided. You have some who say, we shouldn't compromise. Others who say, well, we should compromise. And then there's this argument that runs within the Finnish decision-making circles. If we compromise and we get this wrong, so many of them thought that Stalin was bluffing. But then some of them, especially the foreign minister, for example, said, look, if we're wrong and he's not bluffing, we give away our strategic depth, the little bit that we have. We destroy our fortification line, which we absolutely need because we're so much smaller. We're going to be on the defensive. We don't have a lot of heavy weapons. Then what if they attack us after that? We'll be in an even worse position. So this is kind of the gnashing of teeth and the pulling out of hair that's going on within the Finnish government and military leading up to this infamous attack at the end of November. Internationally, of course, the Germans, shocker of shockers, advise the Finns to accept the Soviet demands. I mean, no kidding, right? It's their ally making these demands. The British and French think that the Soviets are bluffing, and so they advise the Finns to reject the demands, but they're also not willing to give significant help to Finland at the same time. I mean, they're tied up with the war against Germany. And the Soviets, of course, know that no one's going to support the Finns, or they don't expect anyone to support the Finns. So this, of course, emboldens them in their demands and probably makes it easier for them in a way to start the war on such a flimsy pretext. Now, once that war gets going, of course, then the military equation comes into a lot more play, and the political games are kind of take second stage for a little while. So, Matthias, you're the military expert. You're the German officer. Why don't you give us your assessment of the forces in the field here who are going to wage this Finnish campaign?
When you look at how this war is being fought, the usual assessment by everybody and the usual conclusion that everybody jumps to immediately is that the Finns were very good and the Soviets were very bad. That, in a nutshell, sums up the perceived performance. It's interesting once you start drilling in a little bit and scratching the surface a bit more. Let's look at what really happens there. So let's start with the Finns, the Finnish side. So yes, they are individually very, very good. They're very motivated. They have a very efficient system based on conscription, which to a degree they're still doing today with some slight changes, which at the moment all other Western nations are looking at because they're all thinking of reintroducing some sort of conscription. Little side point here. So there are quite a few troops that have been trained properly. So you've got a year, roughly speaking, of conscription. If you want to become an NCO, you become an officer, you spend more time in the army. And of course, then you do all sorts of military training courses. That is all very good. You have a culture of outdoor activities in Finland. And that, of course, helps in a scenario like this. So these guys, even people from the cities, to a large degree, are used to camping outside, making fires, living out in the woods during the winter, just for a few days. So they've got experience in these things. Let's not forget the sauna, of course, very, very important. That needs to play a role here as well. So they know what they're doing. That is very good. The problem that they have is, first of all, the manpower. It's a small country, so the numbers simply aren't there. And of course, it's equipment. And this is one of the big problems that the Finns and the Finnish army, and it's mainly the army we're looking at, not so much the other services, because they're hardly in existence at that particular stage, and they suffer because of underfunding in the 1920s and in the 1930s. So military people, like, for example, Mannerheim, constantly argue for more defense spending. But by the time that the Finnish government realizes there's something brooding, something's happening in the Soviet Union, and it might be a good idea to increase defense spending, it's already too late. So the Finnish army is very much reliant on the infantry, on light infantry with light weapons. There are accounts when the war breaks out that some of these guys have to bring their own rifles. They don't even get uniforms. They only get a few rounds, simply because the military budget had been so small, there have been so many cuts that they couldn't equip them properly. You have only a handful of tanks. Numbers vary a little bit. One of the figures that I've seen was 34, which really isn't a huge tank force. The air force is, again, very small, hardly exists. Now, you could, of course, say that doesn't really matter. It's because of the terrain you're fighting in. Think about the terrain in Finland. Do you need a large tank force? Even today, the Finnish army is not relying heavily on tanks. So you might say, okay, this is it's not really such a big problem if you can equip, if you can train the rest of the army properly. But that is the problem. Even there, you don't have a lot. You've got very willing soldiers who are well trained, but they don't have the means at their disposal. They also have, for example, a lack of artillery. So right from the beginning, you might say, just looking at this, it's not looking up for the Finnish army, for the Finnish military. And of course, they know this. And when you look at the original plans and how they want to fight, it's a delaying battle. We'll talk in more detail about the different stages of the war itself. It's a delaying battle, siege territory, where you have to using static defenses along the Mannerheim line. Again, more on that in a minute, and then try to stop the Soviets somewhere, and then hoping that the international community will come in and either force the Soviets to stop the offensive or start supplying the Finnish military so they can fight a proper war. That's their idea. So you can see immediately this is a flawed plan because they're relying too heavily on outside support, which they have to, because otherwise they simply can't survive. And when we switch to the Soviet side, again, you've got problems. You've got manpower. It's a big country. It is a big army. They can mobilize several 100,000 men for the initial push. Again, more on that later on. But of course, these people are mostly badly equipped. They are badly trained. Lots of them don't really want to be there. So this whole idea of communism, there's still tension within the Soviet Union. And of course, the other big problem that you have is the purges that the army had gone through. So Soviet, being paranoid as ever, purged about 90% of the senior officer corps of the Soviet military, because he thought they were counter-revolutionaries and they had to disappear, and they all get interrogated and they all get shot. So the army that is then assembled and the army that then marches into Finland is an army that is, first of all, completely headless. Well, they've got people at the top. Of course, you replace commanders, but these are people who had to be parachuted in because all the other ones are gone, are dead, executed by Stalin. So how good, how effective can these be? And of course, a factor that I think people often forget, this is an army that is scared. If you're a general, if you're a field marshal, the last thing you want to do is go back to Stalin and say, well, this is not how we can do this. We need to do it differently. And you can see it in the original plans. So, for example, the original plan argued for a 3 to 4 months operation. It was quite methodical, but actually relatively well thought through. And the Soviet high commanders then told, no, you can't do this. It needs to be done in 2 months. And they said, well, that's very, very difficult. Yeah, but Stalin wants that. So they changed the plans. So you now have a 2-month operation, everybody knowing that this is not going to work from a military point of view. But the fear of being scared of Stalin basically pushes these guys into accepting this and making decisions that are not sound from a military point of view. So really difficult on the Soviet side as well. They've got manpower, they've got material, they've got about 1,500 tanks. Compare that to the 34 that the Finns have. But still, there are underlying issues, the underlying problems, and these will now all get played out and come to the fore when we look at what actually happens on the ground and how the campaign or the campaigns develop.
Yeah, I think the point about morale is important, but of course you have to balance it out with the available strength, right? And the Finnish army can mobilize maximum something like 250,000 men, whereas the Red Army has in uniform, now not all of them are going to participate in the Winter War, not all of them are marching into Finland, but they have in uniform 4.5 million men as part of their planned expansion that they're working towards. Of those, something like 425,000 are with the initial invasion force that marches into Finland. Now, the Finns do mobilize their society, of course, to a much deeper degree. They even have women serving in an organization called Lotta Sverd, with female nurses, with munitions workers, in auxiliary positions as well. But that's not really going to compensate entirely for the numbers game. And about those Soviet tanks, they're not all great quality tanks, of course. We're not yet talking about T-34s and KV-1s, but it's better to have 1,500 tanks than 34. In any scenario, right? The old saying goes, better to have a tank than no tank. And I think the truthfulness of that statement increases once you get to numbers like 1,000 or 1,500 tanks. As far as morale goes, I wanted to mention, I dug out a couple of quotes that I thought were very interesting and revealing. Even though the war turns out the way that we, of course, know that it did, still, I feel like this is, it's interesting to get a little view into the mindset. So I've got a quote here from a Soviet officer, a Russian, on the eve of the operation. And he says this: "The troops' political awareness and morale is weakening. They say that supposedly the Soviet government has always said, we do not want an inch of someone else's land, and now we've started a war with Finland. If we explain that it is necessary to strengthen the borders, they'll object that no one attacked us. I myself believe that the contradictions with Finland could have been resolved." So here you have an officer. This is not an official report, by the way, because of course, he would have found himself in the gulag probably if he had passed this along to his superior. This was his diary. Here you have an officer who knows that his men are suffering from poor morale, but he's not even in a position to do much about this because he agrees with the reason that they are suffering from poor morale, and he himself is then suffering from poor morale as a consequence. So it's a kind of a cascade. Sometimes the reasons for morale issues might be different between the rank and file and the officers. Sometimes the officers might have certain tools at their disposal to improve morale or impose more discipline. And here you have the rot, so to speak, not from an ethical point of view, but from, let's say, a political point of view, spreading through the officer corps or the lower officer corps and the rank and file as well. As far as the Finns go, Just 20 years before they have this bitter civil war, you'd think maybe there are still some significant divisions. What about the veterans of the defeated Red Finnish Army from 1918? Will they now rise up and help the Soviets? Some Soviet ideologues think that. I remember reading a great passage where one of them, I forget which one it was, some higher up in the party saying, but the Finnish workers and peasants are going to welcome us as liberators. I mean, people actually still believe this kind of thing after all the historical examples of that not happening. In any case, you have some radical leftists in Finland. They basically say, yeah, okay, the Soviets are communists, but this is a mortal threat to the existence of our community. And we need to band together with people who we don't like ideologically, who we fought with 20 years ago, but now we have the same cause. And one of them basically framed it this way, let's say. Now it wasn't a question of whether we were communists or fascists. The political walls within Finland that we had built and done our utmost to uphold crumbled. Then was the moment, a morning that will never cease to radiate its light on us who experienced it. Now, he gets a little, emotional with radiant light and so on and so forth. But putting that aside a little bit, I mean, the point is clear. Even a radical leftist like him, Sipainen was his name. Apologies again to all Finns out there. Even he's basically saying, I'll work with Finns of any stripe, including fascists, as he terms them, to fight off this outside threat. And so it's clear there of the differences. But, of course, militarily, morale is very important, but it's not the only factor. So that was my segue to switch us back into the military side of things, Matthias. So take us through these battle plans. Take us through what is the Mannerheim line. You mentioned it, right? This is the linchpin of the Finnish defense. What's the terrain like? How's that going to have an impact on those 1,500 tanks? And let's get into the action here.
Well, let's start with the Finnish plans. So the Finns, of course, they know that they have to fight a defensive battle. There are different ways you can fight defensive battles. You can try to hold the enemy right on the front line. So that's a very static defense. The problem with that is it normally means you're going to sustain very high casualties, and you need manpower and you need material. The Finns don't have that. So very early on, they realize this is not the way we can fight. So they're looking at the terrain, particularly in the northern part. You can actually seed terrain and trade terrain for time, because there's nothing of strategic importance up there, apart from the big port that you already mentioned, that you were talked about, and that is Petsamo. Apart from that, it's open territory, well, open, flat at least, but there's tundra, there's forest, pine forest, all these things. So it's very difficult to cross, but there's nothing really of strategic value at that particular point. So it's all concentrating much more on the southern part of the country, because that's where you have the population centers. That's where the industry is. That's where the political centers. Now, of course, let's face it, but it's mainly Helsinki. So you need to defend Helsinki. Helsinki really is your Finnish center of gravity. If Helsinki falls, you've got a big, big problem. So this is what you need to protect. In order to do that, they built this Mannerheim line, which is a line of defensive works which stretches across the Korean isthmus. It sounds very impressive. The problem with that, again, is that in the 1920s and 30s, when people were arguing for more of these defenses being built, they didn't have enough money. So it's not a continuous line. There's a number of bunkers or fortifications, but it's not as strong as the military would have liked it to be. But it is better than nothing. And this becomes the strong point of the Finnish defense. Because the Soviets, if we switch to these guys now, they, looking at the map, come to the same conclusions. And they say, of course, the main thrust needs to go straight into Finland in the area, aiming towards Helsinki. So basically across this isthmus here, that's the point of main effort. And in order to achieve this breakthrough, because they also know that the Finns are defending this with the line and also with a large proportion of their troops, they put an entire army, so that's the 7th Army, under Army Commander 2nd Class Yakovlev, and that has, roughly speaking, 170,000 men. the vast majority of these 1,500 tanks we talked about, and around about 1,300 guns. So that's a lot. So they're going to be pushed in there, fight their way through. They know it's going to be a methodical battle first because they need to fight their way through the defensive positions. And once you've achieved the break in, widen that into the breakthrough, then you break out. And that means you then push your troops down, in particular into the area of Helsinki, and try to occupy this important part of the country. So that's the main thrust that the Soviets are planning to have and to conduct. But there are other ones. And you have one slightly further to the northeast, so that is to the east of Lake Ladoga. That's another army that is coming in here. That's the 8th Army, and the idea here is basically turn the flank of the Finnish forces on the isthmus. So either outmaneuvering the Finns, attacking them in the rear, in the Mannerheim line. So it's a supporting action in order to support the main attack that comes in at the Korean isthmus. You then have another one, which the Soviets think is going to be relatively easy because, according to their assessment, they're not really facing a lot of opposition here. And that's an attack coming in due west, you might say, pretty much in the center of the country. So the idea of the Soviet 9th Army, which is being deployed here, is to basically cut Finland in half. And this is a very famous action. We'll return to this when we look more at the tactical details. So I'm just giving you the operational overview at the moment before we zoom in. And they think that's going to be a walkover because, according to the Soviet assessment, this army, which is not the strongest army, but it's still an army, is facing the sheer mass of one Finnish battalion. So that's going to be easy. That's going to be a walk in the park, and you'll be able to cut Finland in half. And then the last one that comes in is in the very, very far north, and that's the 14th Army, which again is relatively weak compared to the other armies. But they know that the Finnish troops in this area are again very weak, probably just a couple of companies, not more than that. And the aim here really is to seize the Arctic port of Petsamo, because the Soviets are worried that other nations might start supplying the Finns with men and also material. Again, go back to the Russian Civil War, where the Allies had land in Murmansk, which is not far from where this action is taking place. So they know about the importance. Just fast forward to World War II, where the Soviet Northern Front, to a large degree, survives because they managed to hold on to Murmansk. So it's really about seizing the support, cutting off a potential supply line for whoever they think might be supporting the Finns. So that's the whole operation idea in both camps. So you can see immediately the Finnish military on the back foot fighting this defensive war. Of course, they can't go on the offensive. They can't invade Russia or the Soviet Union. We've talked about the numbers. That's completely illusionary. So stand and fight the delaying action if you can, using the fortifications that you have, and hope that some sort of political solution will miraculously appear. So not a particularly strong strategy.
Right, but they don't really have a better one either. That's the dilemma.
That's the problem that they have. And what else can you do? You don't just surrender because you just don't do that. So they're making the best of a very bad strategic situation.
Yeah, no question. And I think it might be worthwhile for me to go on a very, very brief excursion about the geography of the region here, just so we can contextualize some of those plans, some of those Soviet planned operations that you mentioned, right? Finland is a small country. We keep saying that, by population and geostrategic power potential, let's say, for lack of a better word. But by European standards, it's a fairly large country in terms of area, in terms of geography. So it's relatively thin north-south axis. So it goes from the Arctic Ocean down to the Gulf of Finland near St. Petersburg, of course. And this is why there are these opportunities, Matthias, that you were mentioning, that the Soviets see for outflanking or for cutting Finland in two, is because you have a narrow isthmus between the Gulf of Finland and this large lake, Lake Ladoga. That's where the Mannerheim line is concentrated. That's where there's going to be a frontal Soviet assault. But then north of this lake, for like 1,000 kilometers, you just have endless taiga, lakes, forests, swamps, oftentimes marshy type of environment in those forests, huge amounts of space. And this is why the Soviets feel, as you mentioned, that they're going to be able to operate in this space because they have numbers that the Finns, of course, do not. It's also worth pointing out, you mentioned that the Soviets were sort of forced, the commanders were forced into a shorter timeline than they would have liked. One of the political reasons for that timeline, perhaps not the only one, but one, is that they planned to bring victory by December 21st, 1939. Now, maybe there are some of our listeners out there who would know the Soviet political significance of the date of December 21st. I didn't until I came across this little piece of information. I have questions for you if you do know it off by heart, but nonetheless, it's Stalin's birthday. And so that's kind of one of those political anchor points that's pushing the Soviets to accelerate what they're trying to do. In addition, of course, part of the Soviet plan is political. So they start deporting people as the war begins. They start deporting some of these Finns and similarly cultured Karelian people from those border areas. Right? This is the typical Soviet solution to when there are people there who you don't like, you move them 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers to the east. So that starts happening. They also set up a puppet Finnish communist government and then refuse to deal with the legitimate government. They basically say, Finland's not a legitimate state. We are only going to deal with our own puppet Finnish communist government when this conflict is done. So there's also a debate a little bit about how far did the Soviets want to go? Did they really want to create full-on regime change, or were they just looking for territorial expansion? In any case, they are on the march in early December, and they managed to take Petsamo within a few days because the Finns are just spread too thin over this massive area. They start terror bombing the towns. They bomb Helsinki. They bomb Viipuri many, many times. They end up killing nearly 1,000 people with this bombing. In the main area of the front, the Soviets struggle, right? So they're assaulting again and again this series of Finnish fortifications in this narrower part of the front along this Mannerheim line. The Finnish artillery, Finnish marksmen. Right? You, Matthias, mentioned that they have a lot of different outdoorsy type skills. Well, one of those, of course, is for hunting. Finns today they have, I think, the highest proportion of gun ownership in the EU because hunting is such a popular pastime. Of course, the most famous of those is active on the front, the most famous sniper, one of the most famous snipers of all time. His name is very difficult for non-Finns to pronounce. It's something along the lines of Simo Heie. He's known today popularly as the White Death, even though that's a nickname from much later. The Soviets referred to the White Death during the Winter War, but with respect to dying of cold, which many of them are going to start doing pretty soon. His nickname in Finnish at the time, I'm told, roughly translates to the magical marksman or the wonderful marksman, something along those lines. Not quite as catchy as the White Death. I don't know if you'd sell as many books with magical marksman instead of White Death. So the Soviets suffer greatly. The Finns do this without any real anti-tank capabilities. So they are just making up solutions as they go along to deal with the problem of the tanks. The infantry is not as difficult for them to deal with in a frontal assault against their prepared positions. The tanks are very tricky. They even resort to prying the tracks off of tanks with crowbars. So, I mean, that takes, if you'll permit the expression, folks, balls of steel to go up to an enemy tank and start prying its tracks off with crowbars in the middle of action. And famously, they use what they call Molotov cocktails to try to disable Red Army armored vehicles as well. So that's a bit of a taste of the start of the action. I hope I didn't steal all your thunder, Matthias, but fill in the gaps here. What else is going on in these first few weeks in this main Soviet frontal assault?
When you look at the main frontal assault, it's a little bit, to a degree, you might perhaps say like the First World War. It is quite static. It's using materiel if you have it, that is on the Soviet side. So use artillery to keep firing at the enemy, inflicting casualties. If you can, perhaps even destroy these enemy fortifications. And the Finns are sitting in there and they're fighting their defensive battle. So it's a very, very slow advance, as you've already said, by the Soviets. And they're basically bashing their head up against the wall time and again, time and again. But the problem is that in the end, very slowly, gradually, they're beginning to wear the Finns down. It just basically boils down to a numbers game. That's very much what it is. And you can have very, very good fighters. In the end, you're running out of ammunition, you're running out of manpower, and they're beginning to push them back. And you can see there are different stages of this. Don't want to go through all the tactical events here, but they're beginning to push the Finns back from the forward line to the main line of defense, and then eventually also to the rear line. And everyone can see that, yes, it's very bloody, it's a very slow advance, but they are advancing, and that is difficult for the Finns. So it's not looking all that good here. However, it is looking really good somewhere else. I mean, it's not the point of main effort, but particularly from a point of view, you might say, morale, that's very good. And we already mentioned this offensive that's coming in further to the north, trying to cut Finland into two parts. And this is now the site of, you might probably say, the most famous action of this entire war that happens. Because here, a relatively small Finnish formation, so basically a division, manages to defeat and completely destroy two Soviet divisions. So let's have a look at this a little bit more, because it really, really is quite famous. And this is the famous battle of, and here we go, my Finnish pronunciation, please forgive me if I make your ears bleed, my poor Finns out there, Suomussalmi. That sounds very good to me. You probably have no idea what I'm talking about. It is in the center of the country. The Soviets are attacking basically with these two divisions. So it's the 163rd Rifle Division and the 44th Division. Jesse, you talked about the terrain. So there's lots of forests up there. So movements are quite restricted. So they're using a number of roads. Basically, it's mainly one big road that they use that goes, roughly speaking, east to west. And they push down these two divisions down this particular road. So it's the 163rd Division first, then followed by the 44th Division. And the Finnish troops are extremely clever at how they fight. They've got these ski troops. They are very mobile. They're very agile. They are very, as we already said, experienced in this terrain, this type of fighting. They also have some sort of psychologically important weapons. The famous Finnish knives, for example, that the Soviets are really afraid of. So they see a Finn standing behind every single tree trying to cut your throat. I was given one of these knives when I was, I think, 8 by my father. He said, they're very, very sharp. They're very good blades. He said, if you cut yourself, at least you get a very nice, clean cut, gives you a good scar. I'm not quite sure what that tells you about my upbringing, but there we are. So very, very good. And these really scare the Soviets, because I said they think there's a Finnish soldier standing behind every tree. Of course, there isn't, but that's what they're thinking. And the Finns, to cut a very long story short, what they achieved to do is they managed to break up these divisions as they're on the march. And they put them by, basically, they break them up by attacking different units, different battalions on the march, and they break them into what they call moti. And moti is basically is a term for wood that is being stored. Again, my Finnish friends, if that's completely wrong, that's what I know about the Finnish language. Please correct us in the next podcast. Let us know in the comments that everything I said was complete nonsense, and this is what it actually means. But by having these smaller blocks, they can then wipe out one after the other, and they don't have to engage the entire, let's call it, might of these two divisions, because numerically, the Soviets are still stronger. But wiping out one by one by one, the Finns can concentrate their forces, achieve local superiority in man and also materiel, which also, of course, again, is bad for Russian morale. You can see, again, the bad leadership on the Soviet side, because even if you do get split up, what you would like or try to do is either break out or get the units back together or establish a proper all-round defense. There are lots of options, but they don't really do this. And this makes it possible for the Finns in this action, which takes place between the 11th of December and the 8th of January, so really cold, a lot of snow, to defeat and to destroy, completely wipe out these two Soviet divisions. And this is probably the most famous action of this entire war. It's an action that is still being studied today, also by military units, by staff rights and battlefield tours. That's where they go. This is what you look at, because it's such an outstanding achievement. It's really, really great. The problem is, it's great tactically, it's impressive from an operational point of view. Strategically, it doesn't change the situation. You already mentioned the offensive in the very, very north, which is successful for the Soviets. This is a bit of a disaster. It doesn't really matter, because as long as the Soviets win down in the south, where they've got those two pins to attack, we already talked about this is where it matters. And of course, here you've got this very slow grinding through the enemy's defensive positions, but the Soviets are advancing.
Yes, that's true. And of course, now I'm going to try my hand at this one as well. Suomussalmi is quite significant for different reasons as well. One thing I thought was interesting in reading about it is that some of these motis, some of these isolated groups of Soviet troops, they give up without having been ambushed, without facing combat. Why? Because of demoralization, confusion. They haven't been getting orders. They haven't been getting food sent down the line. They are running out of supplies. Some of them don't even have proper winter gear. They don't have enough radios to communicate properly, and so on. And they don't have enough men who are trained to ski properly as well. So that isolation, that tactic, you don't always have to fight to defeat the enemy. And it's a combination of those things that works for the Finns. The Soviet commander actually escapes of one of the divisions, I forget which one, only to be executed for his failures then back home. So he didn't have much luck farther from the battlefield as well. But yes, of course, the Soviet Red Army is still in a position to put overwhelming pressure on the Finns where it matters, at that critical front. There is some discussions in international circles about what to do in sort of February 1940. Stalin comes around to admitting that the war is serious, that it's not like the Polish campaign, which some Soviet leaders had hoped for / expected. The League of Nations takes some action against the Soviet Unions. They expel them from the organization. Unfortunately, this doesn't have much impact on the ground. As the old saying goes, how many divisions does the Pope have? Well, how many divisions does the League of Nations have? It doesn't have any. So it can take these symbolic measures, which are not entirely without their use, but it doesn't have a big impact on the ground. And I think anybody reading the news today in 2024 out there can also see the limits of diplomatic action in the face of violence on the ground. The British and French begin discussing a little bit more seriously about what they might be able to do to help the Finns. There are some international volunteers who come and show up on the Finnish side, mostly from Sweden. But, we're talking in the thousands. This is not going to redress the balance of manpower. The British and French say a lot of kind things. Daladier even mentions at some point something like, oh, maybe we could send 50,000 troops. But I mean, this is pie in the sky. It's not going to happen, primarily because they're worried about the war that they're fighting right now against Germany. It's still in the phony war stage, but you don't want to just willy-nilly be taking on two superpowers when you're not even sure you can deal with one. There is even some talk of strikes against the Soviet Union, so not boots on the ground, so to speak, but maybe striking their naval bases, maybe striking their oil facilities, but none of this happens, essentially. Norway and Sweden, in any case, already said, we're not going to let British or French troops pass through our territory or our waters to get to Finland. And part of the reason they do this is because Germany threatens them. And again, we see the German-Soviet kind of connection here ending up on the same side of things. Part of the reasons why the Soviets are able to continue exerting this pressure as well is they do make some adjustments. They're not a monolithic zombie just walking into the buzzsaw again and again. They don't necessarily make the same type of adjustments that the German army might make or the late war British, Canadian, American armies might make, but they do make some adjustments. Two new generals take the reins, Timoshenko and Shaposhnikov. They had been critical of the earlier plans. They introduced some new training for a bit more coordination between combined arms fighting elements on the Soviet side, and they bring in more troops. So they bring the numbers up to 600,000 troops. And of course, the pressure then becomes pretty much unbearable. So take us through the final stages here.
When you look at the fighting, again, it all boils down to what happens in the isthmus, because that, as I've now said a number of times, really is the point of main effort. It's the center of gravity. The Finns are getting pushed back. They're overwhelmed now to a large degree by the Soviets, who are getting better. You've already mentioned it, because it's also an army that is learning by doing, as every army does. Learning by doing in war normally means learning by dying. And the Soviets are very good at dying in large numbers, as we know, but they do learn from that as well. And in these big offensives and pushes that they have, particularly in February and early March, they managed to push the Finns back and back and back. And by early March, they have pushed the Finns back to the very, very last defensive line. That is in and around the place, you already mentioned it before, Viipuri. And everybody knows, well, once that is lost, there's not much behind that. There's no defensive line. Once the Soviets have broken through here, they can then march onto Helsinki. And the desperate fighting that takes place there in early March really doesn't go all that well for the Finns. In other areas, they also launch a number of counterattacks, desperate counterattacks, because they think they need to seize the initiative, but they fail. So everyone can see this is not really going well. So on the 12th of March, General Heinrichs, it's interesting, a lot of German-sounding names in the Finnish military. He orders the withdrawal from Viipuri. And at that stage, you can see this is the sign, well, this is over. The Finns are not going to hold the line anymore. They're not going to win, whatever win means in the situation, however you define win, but they're not going to come out victorious here. And that's not going to happen. At that stage, you already have peace negotiations going on, and also on the 12th of March, the Finnish and the Soviet negotiators then sign the so-called Moscow Peace Treaty. And yes, it is in the end, it is a military victory for the Soviets. Everyone keeps saying, well, the Soviets weren't good; they didn't know what they were doing. It was a great defensive victory for the Finnish military. Which, when you look at the pure military level, yes, that you might be right. They inflict much higher casualties on the Soviet side than they sustain themselves. But in the end, strategically, it is still a Soviet victory. And I think that gets forgotten quite often, because we tend to look at the incompetence or the perceived incompetence of the Soviets so very often. I think there are two reasons for it. The first one is it just fits our particularly Western view of the world, that the Russians are always incompetent, they don't know what they're doing, they don't think, they just follow their leaders. All these stereotypes that we have. That's the first one that we still see today. The second one is probably because this has implications for what happens at a later stage in the war. And that, of course, is particular lessons that the Soviets learned themselves, but also the lessons or perceived lessons that other nations take away from this particular campaign. And of course, that means in particular what the Germans are thinking of this. Because we're now moving into 1941, we're now thinking about the plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union and the expectation of what will happen once the Germans invade. So Jesse, what is the general expectation in the world when you invade the Soviet Union after this experience of the Winter War?
Well, of course, this plays right into the German expectations, right? So they already have an ideological eye to conquests in the East, of course. This is something that Hitler's written about for years and years and talked about for years, that he wants to expand towards the East. And they have this ideological idea of the Slavic peoples, who are the majority in the Soviet Union, of course, as being inferior. So when you see a performance like that, where the Red Army struggles mightily to defeat such a smaller power, if you're already predisposed to say, well, yeah, we want to conquer them, and yeah, they are inferior to us, you're going to come to that conclusion much more rapidly and with a lot more confidence. And this is, of course, what the Germans do for a variety of reasons, but the Winter War certainly plays a role there. We've talked about it in previous episodes. There's this absolutely famous quote of Hitler's where we just have to kick the door in. And part of the genesis of that assumption, of that hubris, is the performance of the Red Army in this conflict. But I'm glad that you started your last contribution by emphasizing the fact that the Soviet Union wins this war. Maybe they don't achieve every single goal, because if they were really trying for full-on regime change and a puppet regime of communists in Finland, they don't achieve that, but they still achieve most of their territorial and sort of strategic goals, let's say military strategic goals. They take, just to summarize some of the terms of the treaty, they take 10% of Finland's pre-war land area, including its second largest city, Viipuri, which is today still a part of Russia, known as Viborg. There are about 400,000 Finnish people who are essentially ethnically cleansed and flee farther into Finland over the new border. And the Soviets get their naval base for 50 years, a 50-year lease on a naval base on Finnish territory in the Gulf of Finland. This all costs them about 125,000 dead, whereas the Finns only suffer 25,000 dead, and only, of course, these are 25,000 human beings, but we're talking about historical statistics here at the moment, and 900 civilians killed in the bombing. I'm also glad that you pointed out the fact that the casualty ratio is not always relevant to whether you achieve your objective in a war. War is a political endeavor as well as a military one. And even if you don't perform particularly well militarily, if you achieve your political goal, you can be said to have won the war. I sometimes come across people arguing that, for example, the Germans in World War II won a certain battle, this one or that one, be it Stalingrad, but especially other ones like Kursk, for example. Why? Well, look at the killed to died ratio. Look at how many Soviets they took out versus how many German troops were lost. War's not a video game. It's not measured on a killed to died ratio. It's got a different yardstick. And so I think this winter war is one example for that. And I hope that for any listeners who aren't clear on that concept, or who had thought, but maybe the Germans at Kursk, for example, did much better than historians give them credit for. No, I think the yardstick is different. This, of course, has some impact, as I mentioned. It also has an impact because this war kind of restarts, doesn't it, in 1941? Because when Germany invades the Soviet Union, Finland then gets involved as well. I don't know if you want to say a few words about that, sort of carry the story forward a little bit in terms of the impact of the Winter War as well?
I think it's absolutely important, and it's essential that you talk about this, because, as you say, it doesn't stop here. So Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941 on the 22nd of June. And of course, well, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If you're a Finnish political or military leader, why wouldn't you go with the Germans to claim the territories back that you've just lost? That makes absolute and perfect sense. So they then fight alongside the Germans against the Soviets all the way till 1944, and they fight in that particular area. So in their area, so close to Leningrad, close to Murmansk, which the Germans are trying to seize to cut off these supply lines. So this is where they're not getting sent to, for example, you mentioned the name, the Stalingrad front or other parts of the front line. So that's where they're being used. So that, of course, makes it politically also easier internally to say, well, you know what, that's the term, the continuation war. We're continuing this war. We're not the aggressor. We were attacked, but we need to continue this in order to get our territories back. Again, what you then also have is the relatively close and stable political links. Mannerheim and Hitler. Mannerheim is not a Nazi, but they kind of get on. Language helps. Mannerheim is absolutely fluent and flawless in German, so these things help, simple things like this. Well, unlike my Finnish, he was very good at German, there we go. So these things are really quite useful. But then in 1944, it's obvious that Germany is not going to win the war, the Germans are being pushed back, also out of this area. So the siege of Leningrad is lifted, they're pushed into the Baltic states. And that, of course, also means that the Soviets can now push the Finnish troops back again. And they're about to invade Finland again. So again, you might say it's a continuation of the continuation in many ways. At that point, the Finnish government then basically asks for peace. Switching sides is too strong a term, but it is interesting what happens then, because the Soviet government then first of all says, yeah, okay, that's fine, but we're going back to the original treaty. So you're still losing all these territories that you had originally lost. And also you still have German troops on your soil. So these need to disappear. And first, in the beginning, the Finns were kind of lukewarmly, half-heartedly telling the Germans to get out because they were still relatively pro-German at that stage. And they'd fought together for 3 years. So there's a German term for that, Waffenbrüderschaft, which doesn't really translate, which means, what's the translation of Waffenbrüderschaft?
Maybe brotherhood in arms?
Brotherhood in arms, probably, yeah. To German ear, it means a bit more, but that's probably the best literal translation. Yeah, I think you're right. So they were still very much, well, I wouldn't say in favor of the Germans, but still kind of, well, relatively positive towards them. But then the Soviets say, well, no, you're giving them too much time. Well, we want you to push them out. And you've got 2 weeks. If you're not done it within the 2 weeks, or that relatively short time frame you're given, we are going to invade your country. So it then comes to the third episode here that no one ever looks at, and that's completely forgotten about, and no one ever talks or writes about. And that's what different names for it. The most famous one is the Lapland War, where you then have the Germans fighting against the Finns. It's a very half-hearted affair because they kind of like each other. They don't want to get into trouble, so to speak. The Germans know they've lost the war anyway, and they're trying to withdraw to Norway because that's still occupied by the Germans. But even this episode costs, roughly speaking, 5,000 casualties. So 5,000 dead, that is. So you talked about historical statistics. In the context of 1944, that's like a drop in the ocean, but it's still 5,000 lives that are lost. So you can see how this war that we looked at, 1939, 1940, has all sorts of implications for what then happens in 1941, all the way up to 1944, and after that as well. And today, when you go to Finland, I was just talking the other day to a battlefield tour guide and a brilliant tour manager, just come back from a tour to Finland. For example, if you want to go and see the Mannerheim line, that's not possible, because that is in modern-day Russia. So if you want to do a battlefield tour, well, you can, but you're not going to see the bunkers of the main defensive line that they had, because they're in modern-day Russia. So you can see the long-term implications are still very much there.
Indeed, the long shadow of what, in the Second World War context, is a small war. It's a war within the Second World War, but certainly a fascinating one that I think is more than worthwhile to investigate and draw the lessons from, so to speak. I mean, I think there are a lot of parallels that we could have made with the fighting in Ukraine today, perhaps, and the geopolitics surrounding that. But we won't go too deep into that rabbit hole. I'll let you listeners do that on your own. Thanks for being with us today. For those of you who are new listeners in particular, please do go ahead and leave a review if you like the podcast, especially if you're on Apple Podcasts. That would help us with, of course, the new powers in our society and culture, the great algorithm. In any case, hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we'll see you in the next one. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. But he should be recording by Mir, Jesus. There is, now you think the Second World War is a long and bitter conflict. Imagine the war between French, German, and English that is constantly going on between my head and my brain and my tongue. God, yeah, it's a war of attrition.
It's all the German goose-stepping all across the other and over the other languages. There we are. That's just what happens.
It must be. It must be. My French is still better than my German, but it's harder for me to speak it because I haven't spoken it regularly in like 15 years. And German words are the ones that continuously spring to mind.
That's the way it should be. Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, you're a non-biased source for that. Absolutely.
Oh, funny.